Welcome back to Walk the Talk and welcome back to NDTV. How has this trip to Bihar been different?
Between 2005 and 2015, we saw a remarkable change in Bihar. Under the Modi government, he tried to shift the balance. State seems to be getting stuck in a welfare trap. 3% of GDP has been announced in pre-poll welfare schemes.
President Trump has been giving India a really tough time on tariffs and being completely unreasonable.
India needs to turn less protectionist in general, open up much more to trade with other countries.
What outlook are you forming for the Indian markets?
The Indian market will see greater allocations from global investors.
Hello and welcome. You're watching NDTV Walk the Talk. We are currently on a makhana farm in Purnia in Bihar. And my guest for the first episode of Walk the Talk is well-known global investor, thinker, Ruchir Sharma. Ruchir, what an epic setting to get Walk the Talk started. I hope you're comfortable. I hope you're well. Welcome to Walk the Talk.
Thanks.
It's great to have you back on NDTV.
Yes.
So you've been traveling the state the last few days, as you often do during elections. How has this trip to Bihar been different from the earlier trips that you've done?
Well, I have to say that we started this trip to Bihar 4 days ago, but I was just comparing, like in terms of what I've seen on this trip compared to my previous trips. Our first trip was in 2005, and since then there's been dramatic change as far as Bihar is concerned. When like the dramatic change is hard to see when you're in this kind of surrounding because these things haven't changed. But I think that if I were to split Bihar's trajectory over the last 20 years, between 2005 and 2015, we saw a remarkable change in Bihar. This is my 6th election trip to Bihar of the 32 election trips I've done in India. Since 2005, we first came here in Feb 2005. Since then, obviously, if I were to compare, the change in Bihar has been quite significant at one level. But I'd say that the problem is that most of the change happened between 2005 and 2015. In the last 5 or 10 years, I feel that the state has again begun to stagnate somewhat. And the kind of poverty that I've seen on this trip has been quite heartbreaking. We were there in places even close to Patna, in places like Maner and stuff like that. And we saw like a similar sort of setting there, but to see young children in the deep trying to sort of pluck fish out of a pond, which was completely muckraken and also filled with filth. I think it really sort of affected a lot of people on that trip, the kind of poverty that we've seen on this trip. So I think that's the sort of thing about Bihar, and this is the thing about India, that everything, as I keep saying, that it's a country that consistently disappoints the optimists and the pessimists. And I think that on this trip, though, after the optimism I felt for Bihar in the first 10 or years that I traveled and saw the change, this trip has been a bit dispiriting. That the kind of change that we have seen, just hasn't been as dramatic as what we were seeing, or what should be the case for what is still the poorest state of India.
भाई साहब, क्या नाम है आपका?
वीरेंद्र ऋषि
जी। तो कितने घंटे लगाते हैं आप पानी के अंदर ये मखाना निकालते वक्त एक दिन में?
वो निकालते हैं 2-4 घंटा निकालते हैं, हो जाता है मजदूरी।
तो निकाल के फिर कितना पैसा मिलता है एक दिन का?
एक दिन का मिल जाता है, कभी कभी जब ज्यादा मिलता है तो 1-1 हजार मिल जाता है, नहीं तो 500-600 यही मिलता है।
500-600 और साल में कितने दिन की मजदूरी हो पाती है इसमें?
ये देखिए 6 महीना जो है, 3 महीना हम लोग इसको उठाते हैं।
तो सबसे बड़ी प्रॉब्लम क्या है, समस्या क्या है यहाँ पे?
यहाँ पे है गरीब आदमी, हम लोग ये मखाना उठा कर को खा रहे हैं। हाँ, मेहनत करते हैं मखाना पानी में कादा में से निकाल कर को, यही सब करते हैं।
This is something, Ruchir, that the government is trying to push quite a lot. The makhana industry in Bihar. There's also a lot of natural makhana which can be picked. It's also a health food. But what strikes me is that this is really one of the very few industries that there is in this part of Bihar. Yes, and that's quite unfortunate. There should be makhanas, but there should be a lot more as well.
That's exactly been the problem with Bihar, Rahul, as you said, because in 2005, the state was obviously, terrible in every which way. After that, under Nitish Kumar, in the first term when we came here between 2005 and 2010, we saw significant improvement in the roads, the infrastructure, also in the law and order situation. Then between 2005 and 2015 when we came, we saw a significant improvement in electrification. And now those benefits have largely stuck, even though some of the roads we have traveled on, you can see are in a state of real disrepair. It still takes a
But
very
some
long
of the
time.
roads are much better as well. I mean, given how
Compared
Bihar,
to
of course.
2005, everything is dramatically better. So that is the starting base for me. In fact, one of the most memorable election trips I had was we went to Champaran and Bethiya in 2005. And I remember traveling from Bethiya to Patna those days, just over 200 kilometers, took us nearly 8 hours, right? So,
And now you've got an airport in Purnia, you line straight in.
Yeah, we got
Darbhanga, Purnia, so many airports which have opened up where you can come straight from Delhi, in Ahmedabad, other places land here. So there has been
massive improvement compared to 2005. My point is that after 2015, the next step in the evolution of the state should have been the creation of new industries, employment, and I think that's where the state is stalling and struggling to find its next growth model. And therefore, you also see about the fact that what states' growth trajectory has been. We can look at it anecdotally, and then also to match it as to what the economic data is also showing, right? So anecdotally, as I said, 2005 to 2015, dramatic improvement. Since then, not so much. And the economic data sort of backing it up. If you look at Bihar's growth rates, between 2005 and about 2015 or so, Bihar's per capita income, which was always the lowest in India, began to slowly close the gap with the rest of India, right? Bihar's per capita income compared to the rest of India was about 30% in 2005. That gap closed to about 35% by about 2014-15. So two very good Nitish Kumar BJP terms largely in that period. But in the last 10 years, that gap has again begun to widen. And so Bihar's per capita income today at about 70,000 rupees a year or so is now back to being like barely less than 30% or so, or about 30% of India's per capita income, which is about 2 lakh rupees or so. So the gap is again begun to widen, and you can see it anecdotally that in the last 5-7 years, I think that the growth model is struggling here. It's struggling to create jobs, struggling to create new industries. And so therefore you can have the infrastructure, but then what do you do with it, I think, is the key next step, which some states like Odisha and all have done more on in improving. But in Bihar, that progress is stalled both anecdotally and what the data is showing us.
So they take the raw makhana seeds out from this farm and then they take it to a factory. Let's head there now. From the makhana farm, we've now come to what's called a makhana factory. They're taking the raw makhanas and roasting them here. Ruchir, if you were a global investor looking at the Bihar story as a stock, what would you like to see the new government do to give someone like you and others the confidence to go and invest in the Bihar story?
Well, I think that, Bihar, obviously there's a lot of talent here, but the education system is still very weak. When I speak to business people, I don't think anyone's really looking to invest in Bihar because it's very hard to find talent which remains here. And then I also think that in terms of that, there needs to be like a vision about what industries exactly can be built here. Because as I said,
so what kind of industries can come?
Yeah,
because
so
they're focusing a lot on agro-based industries. Is that really the best approach? Because it is a landlocked state.
Yeah, that's right. So that is a real problem for them. But I also feel that in terms of things like real estate, construction, even that kind of stuff I'm finding is very hard for Bihar to pick up on.
Why?
So I think that it's still got to do with the residual image of what the law and order is like here. It's still got to do with the residual image about what the past, still had to do here. And also the fact that this is my big fear about Bihar, really, to be honest, that the state seems to be getting stuck in a welfare trap. And what do I mean by this? Even in this election, nearly 3% of GDP has been announced in pre-poll welfare schemes. Now, when you're spending so much money on welfare,
but it's happening in all states.
I know, but Bihar is the highest. So you're totally correct. So I think that, and this has been my biggest problem as far as the India growth story is concerned, because we speak about Bihar, but I've always said so for many years, in our interviews, that why India can never be like China. Because when China was at a similar stage of its development, it was just investing everything in infrastructure. It was investing nothing on welfare, right? Because it was ruthless capitalism. Like in India, the issue currently is the fact that we're still investing a lot in welfare. Under the Modi government, he tried to shift the balance towards infrastructure away from the welfare that the UPA was going down under. But it seems to me, and especially after the setback or however you want to describe what happened in the national election in 2024, the series of state elections after that, the amount that the state governments are spending on welfare has gone up significantly.
But it's a trap because the opposition, for example, in this election, Tejasvi is promised one government job in every household across the state.
And now he's done
more.
more.
If that happens, then that's 4x the current state budget of Bihar.
And that's exactly the problem. Therefore, like you said, like a welfare trap. Because one of the things that we have learned, which I'm sure you know as well, that a big swing factor in this election from the travel that we have done in the last few days has been this 10,000 rupee Jivika scheme that was rolled out by the Bihari government for women in this state, right? I think that's been a big swing factor in favor of the NDA government and possibly why at this stage they are favored to win this election. But now Tejasvi, to counter that, is promising 30,000 rupees. So I think that's the kind of vicious loop that states get stuck in. You know, when you see scenes of poverty here, or when you see, you know, like people here, you want to like almost make, donations, charity, do grants. But at the end of the day, no growth model can be based on that. You can paper over cracks with that, but a growth model has to come bottom up, driven by employment, driven by new jobs and stuff. So my fear for states like Bihar and in general in India is of us getting stuck in this welfare trap where we are now spending more and more, and particularly like in elections, to win elections. And this is the upside and the downside of digitization. That, you know, we attended Prime Minister Modi's speech somewhere, and he rightly pointed out that, listen, under Rajiv Gandhi's time, he would lament that of every 1 rupee which is spent, only 15 paisa gets to the intended beneficiary. And that became a very sort of famous characterization of how the welfare state in India leads to many leakages. Now, because of digitization, what we have seen is that the leakages have gone down significantly. Most people now who have been promised whatever the government is saying are actually getting direct money into their bank accounts and stuff. So, that's a great upside in terms of how the leakages are being stopped. But also the downside is that governments close to elections now find it so convenient that you just transfer money to people's accounts and you're able to swing the election. I think it started in earnest with Madhya Pradesh. And then what happened was Maharashtra. I think we saw it in a very dramatic swing that took place. And in Bihar too, I think that 3-4 months ago, the assessment that I was hearing about this election was, it's a pretty close election. Now, having traveled for the last few days, now we get to hear that the election is very much the NDA is in the lead in this election. There are many reasons for that, but possibly the leading reason for that, as I said, is the Jivika scheme.
I just want to spend some time talking to the people who are working here. भाई साहब थोड़ा हमारे दर्शकों को समझाइए क्या कर रहे हैं अभी आप?
मखाना भून रहे हैं।
मखाना भून रहे हैं। तो कितना वक्त लगता है इसमें?
इसमें लमसम एक बार यहाँ जाने में लगता है लमसम 1 मिनट 2 मिनट लग जाता है।
1-2 मिनट में हो जाता है। तो कितने पैसे बनते हैं आपके दिन के?
वो नहीं बता सकते हम कितने पैसे बनते हैं। इसमें मेहनत के ऊपर है, जो जितना मेहनत करेगा उसको उतना पैसा होगा।
मतलब कैसे कि जितना आपने मखाना भून दिया उस हिसाब से पेमेंट मिलेगी?
नहीं, जितना हम लोग सुखाते हैं उस हिसाब से होता है। ऐसे भी होता है कि अगर धूप नहीं निकलेगा तो पूरा दिन का मेहनत खराब हो जाएगा।
अच्छा, धूप की क्यों जरूरत है? वरना ये
इसको दिन भर सुखाना पड़ता है, टाइमिंग से सुखाना पड़ता है। इसमें नहीं ज़्यादा धूप लगना चाहिए, नहीं कम लगना चाहिए।
तो पिछले कई दिन से तो बहुत बारिश
बंद था, काम बंद था उस दिन से।
तो अभी जो चुनाव हो रहे हैं उसमें सबसे बड़े मुद्दे आपके क्या हैं?
सबसे बड़े हम लोग मखाना फोड़ते तो मखाना का मुद्दा लेके चलेंगे ना।
क्या मखाना में क्या आपको चाहिए?
मखाना में हम लोग को यही चाहिए कि जो रेट होता है ना नीचे ऊपर, वो नहीं हो।
कितना ऊपर नीचे होता है रेट?
एक दिन में 100-150 गिर जाता है रेट।
हर रोज ऊपर नीचे होता है?
हाँ, ये होता है मखाना में। यहाँ मिनट में ही रेट गिरा देता है। जैसे अब वो तो आगे वाला आदमी जाने, गद्दी वाला जाने। जैसे हम लोग यहाँ फोड़ते हैं ना, तो हम लोग इतना रिस्क लेके फोड़ते हैं कि हम लोग का पैसा बच जाए, लेकिन कोई लिमिट नहीं है कि बचेगा कि नहीं बचेगा।
तो अगर इस उद्योग को और बेहतर करना हो आपके हिसाब से, उसके लिए क्या करने की ज़रूरत है?
जैसे हमारे यहाँ पे गुड़िया का जो रेट था, जैसे हम लोग खरीदे 30,000, अभी जो है कि बाज़ार में 20,000 हो चुका है। और मार्केट लावा का रेट तभी 900 रुपया था। अभी
तो जितने का आपने खरीदा उससे सस्ता हो गया है?
सस्ता हो गया है।
अरे?
अभी हम लोग को बार कुंटल पे 10,000 20,000 करके नुकसान जा रहा है ये गुड़िया। अभी बाहर हम लोग को जैसे पता चला, व्यापारी लोग से कांटेक्ट जैसे करते हैं तो माल बाहर नहीं जा रहा है, इलेक्शन है, ये है वो है, बहुत तरह का बात बताता है हम लोग को, जिसके कारण जो है कि अभी खरीदारी बहुत कम हो रहा है बाज़ार में। सबके घर में माल स्टॉक है, रेट के कारण हम लोग को नुकसान हो रहा है। अगर रेट 900 रुपया कुछ आ जाए तो हम लोग को बहुत राहत हो सकता है। हम लोग को सरकार से यही मांग है कि ये बाहर जितना से जितना मतलब सेल हो, रेट यहाँ पर मिले हम लोग को बढ़िया।
चलिए, आप इसको पहले वहाँ डालते हैं, फिर ज़रा प्रोसेस समझाइए, जो हमारे दर्शक देख रहे हैं उनको बताइए कैसे होता है।
हम इसको गर्म करते हैं पहले, यहाँ पे गर्म करते हैं, इसको गर्म करते जाते हैं। जब वहाँ पे जा करके वो खुद आवाज़ करने लगता है तो देख रहे हैं वहाँ पर फूल जाता है। हाँ, फूल नहीं जाता, उसको पीटना पड़ता है। वो लमसम 3 किलो या 2.5 किलो का होगा, उसको मारना पड़ता है, तब फूलता है। हाँ, उसका हाथ जल जाता है। आगे वाला घानी जो काटता है ना, जैसे वो निकाल के देता है उसको, तो उसका भी हाथ जल जाता है इसमें।
तो खा सकते हैं वो आखिर वाला कि नहीं खा सकते हैं? खा सकते हैं। Freshly popped makhana. This is actually Ruchir, right?
Absolutely, want to try it? हम भी पूछ लें आपसे एक सवाल.
Come, sit. Ruchir, try some freshly popped makhanas. I promise you they taste better than anything that comes out of a packet.
हम भी पूछ लें आपसे एक सवाल पूछ लें क्या? पर ये बताइए कि पिछले 5 या 10 साल में बिहार की कितनी तरक्की हुई है?
बहुत तरक्की हुई है।
तो आपने क्या देखा है, बताइए? आपने क्या देखा है? आपने
हम लोग को घर द्वार मिला है।
हाँ,
इंदिरा आवास है।
अच्छा,
बस राशन कार्ड देता है।
तो आप बिहार की सरकार से खुश हैं काफी?
जी।
आप वोट डालेंगे इस बार? किस
डालेंगे?
अच्छा, किसको डालेंगे?
और फूल साहब को।
हाँ,
फूल साहब को।
फूल को डालेंगे। और 5 साल पहले किसको 5 साल पहले आपने किसको वोट डाला था?
तो जाएंगे सर, तो किसको डालेंगे नहीं डालेंगे तो अंदर जाके मतदान करेंगे।
अच्छा, चलिए, तो इस बार आपको लग रहा है एनडीए की सरकार वापस आ रही है? चलिए, ठीक है।
These makhanas taste better than anything that comes out of a plastic packet. Fresh from a makhana factory in Purnia. The most delicious election makhanas ever. Ruchir, it's very interesting that you randomly stopped some person working at a makhana factory and he claims to have got the house from the government. You were talking about welfare before this.
Yes.
You know, on the ground,
Yes.
there are beneficiaries, and therefore if he's got a house in the last 5 years, he's mighty chuffed about it.
No, absolutely. As I said, that there's been significant improvement in the delivery mechanism of the welfare scheme. My issue is that when you're spending 3% of GDP on a year like this on welfare, then you have that much money less left for you to spend on other things as infrastructure. Because if you look at other states as well, when they've announced this massive pre-poll schemes, once the government comes to power, then they're once again forced to deal with the reality. How do we keep the deficit at 3% of GDP? Then how do we start cutting expenditure in other areas? Often you're forced to cut expenditure then on things like infrastructure. Now, as you know, infrastructure is the long-term key to growth. You feel like the fact that we should be giving money out to people and you know, why not? Because it's making a difference to people's lives. But as I know, that there's also something called a welfare trap, and that once you start doing that, there's no end to it. And that's what the problem of India has been in some way for the last 50 to 60 years. And in a nutshell tells you why we are never going to be able to grow at 9 or 10% by following the kind of ruthless capitalism that the likes of China have done.
I see some women working in the farm there. Given how important the Nari Shakti vote bank is for all parties, it'll be interesting to see.
Well, I think that's Nitish Kumar's superpower, isn't it? Which is the fact that how popular he's with women in particular.
And he's been at it for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think that even with the BJP, I think that they've really figured out that a real, one possible way of trying to break across caste lines is to consolidate the women vote. And I think that's the way Indian politics also is like shifting. But yeah, Nitish Kumar is one of the first, I think, regional politicians who sort of showed that.
No, and there seems to be a lot of support for prohibition. Like PK wants to do away with it. Apparently women don't like it. They like the idea that there's prohibition and men folk can't get hold of alcohol easily.
Yeah, but I think that that's the whole contradiction, right? Which is that good politics not always good economics. Because again, when we traveled, there are a couple of things that we have learned. One, that the problem of drug abuse and smack sort of intake here has gone up a lot, and there's a lot of illegal liquor business, which is also doing unfortunately rather well, like in this state. So I think that there's a reason why most states in India don't have prohibition, only very few do. And in Bihar, the other sort of economy here is that it's just so state dependent. No state spends as much as a share of its economy as Bihar does in terms of government spending. This is the highest government spending as a share of the economy, and all the revenue is really coming from the center and the state grants. There's hardly any revenue being generated by state activity, right? So, and by obviously banning prohibition, you've taken another source of revenue away. So this is a balance that any state has to get correct. It's one thing for a state like Gujarat to have prohibition, but it's another, for a state like Bihar to have it, which doesn't have much of a local economy producing local revenues, and also the consequence of so much illegal drugs and other, liquor, which is happening, illegal liquor being in this state. But again, lots of women are happy with it.
Let's find out. Let's go talk to some of the women here. दीदी, आप में से किसी को पैसा मिला, वो जो नीतीश बाबू 10,000 रुपए दे रहे हैं, आपको मिला है क्या पैसा?
हाँ,
मिला है?
हाँ।
कब मिला आपको पैसा?
दशहरे लगा।
हाँ? दशहरे में मिला पैसा? सीधे बैंक में आया?
हाँ।
हाँ?
हाँ।
अच्छा, तो खुश हैं आप उससे?
तब खुश न रहता।
खुश रहते। क्या किया पैसे का आपने?
क्या करेंगे, बिजनेस करेंगे, बकरी लिए हैं, गाय लिए हैं,
गाय?
मशीन लिए हैं।
हाँ?
सिलाई मशीन
खरीदे हैं?
हाँ।
कितना बकरी खरीदा है आप?
मशीन लिए हैं 8,000 में।
8,000 का सिलाई का मशीन लिया?
हाँ।
क्या कीजिएगा मशीन लेके?
कपड़ा सीते हैं।
सीते हैं या सिएंगे?
सिए हैं।
सी रहे हैं?
हाँ। काम लगता है, यो काम करते हैं, वो करते हैं, दोनों काम। मतलब काम लग गया तो यो भी काम करते हैं, मकई रोपने चलाते हैं, कपड़ों सी लेते हैं।
और जो 50,000 रुपए और 2 लाख रुपए और देने की बात है, वो
तो मिलते तब है ना कोनो काम होता।
आप ट्राई करेंगी लेने के लिए?
हाँ, तब दे लेवे ना तब।
तो इससे कोई फर्क पड़ा? जैसे पहले आप सरकार के बारे में सोच रही थी, अब जैसे आप सोच रही, कोई फर्क है कि नहीं फर्क है? मतलब कि पहले आप सरकार के बारे में या नीतीश कुमार के बारे में जो सोच रहे थे, 10,000 रुपए मिलने के बाद कुछ बदलाव हुआ कि नहीं हुआ? हाँ? Okay, she's just happy that she's got the 10,000 rupees and she's now got some sewing machines and some bakris apparently, which she hopes to rear.
Yeah, but it's interesting that not everyone has sort of received it. So, whether everyone's going to vote along those lines or no, but yes, it does seem to me that this has been a decisive factor in this election.
चाची, आपको ये पैसा मिला कि नहीं मिला, ये जो 10,000 रुपए मिल रहे हैं? हाँ? मिला? नहीं? मिला आपको?
हाँ।
क्या किया 10,000 रुपए के साथ?
बकरी ले लो छिए।
कितना बकरी लिए?
4 ठो।
4 ठो। कितने का बकरी आया 4 ठो?
8,000 का।
8,000?
हाँ।
तो बकरी का क्या कीजिएगा?
पोसबे।
अच्छा, पशुपालन करेंगे?
हाँ।
खुश हैं इससे? तो वोट किसको देंगे?
वोट की करा देंगे।
अच्छा, वोट नहीं बताएंगी, ठीक है। शी इज हैप्पी दैट शी इज गॉट द 8,000 रुपीज, और वोट किसको देना है ये नहीं बताना है, बट यू कैन सी द स्माइल। दीदी, आपको पैसा मिला नहीं मिला? आपको नहीं मिला? अरे पर आपकी साथियों को तो मिल गया, आपको नहीं मिला?
नहीं मिला है।
उम्मीद है कि मिलेगा कि नहीं मिलेगा?
क्या पता, उम्मीद है कि नहीं है।
अच्छा, ये बताइए कि आपके गांव में कितने लोगों को मिला और कितने लोगों को नहीं मिला? ये
हम लोग 12 दीदी हैं, तो 12 गो में 8 गो मिला है।
8 को मिल गया?
हाँ।
और 4 को नहीं मिला?
नहीं।
अच्छा, जो
तो जिसको नहीं मिला उसको बुरा लग रहा है कि नहीं मिला?
नहीं, तो बुरा से लगेगा, ये करेगा पैसा की,
वेट करेगा पैसा की। तो अगर पैसा मिलेगा तो क्या कीजिएगा उसका?
क्या करेंगे, लेंगे बकरी ये लिए, अब क्या करेंगे?
जैसे बाकियों ने बकरी लिया।
हाँ।
फिर बकरी का क्या करेंगे? बकरी लेके
बकरी ले क्या करेंगे? पोसेंगे, पालेंगे उसको, बड़ा करेंगे, क्या करेंगे उसको।
तो अभी आपको मजदूरी का कितना पैसा मिलता है?
250 रुपया।
250 रुपया दिन का?
हाँ।
कितने दिन का मजदूरी हो जाता है?
कितने दिन की मजदूरी लगता है तो करते हैं, 10 दिन 15 दिन, बचना तो नहीं है।
आपके हिसाब से इस वक्त आपके सबसे बड़े मुद्दे क्या हैं, दिक्कतें क्या हैं, प्रॉब्लम क्या है?
पर गाँव हम लोग को कहाँ जो है, कुछ नहीं है।
कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है?
नहीं।
ऐसे कैसे हो सकता है कि प्रॉब्लम नहीं? दिक्कत क्या है?
दिक्कत हम लोग का क्या है, कुछ नहीं।
तो ये बताइए, आप सरकार से खुश हैं? इधर सरकार से खुश हैं कि नहीं खुश हैं?
सरकार से खुश हैं, सभी से खुश हैं।
अच्छा,
Interesting, Ruchir, that 8 out of 12 women in her circle seem to have got the money, and she's quite pleased, which baffles me no end. Just logically speaking, the man's been in power for 2 decades, anti-incumbency inevitably builds, and yet they seem quite settled with their lives and quite pleased.
Yeah, well, I don't know if they're quite pleased or settled, but I think that
she's not angry and furious as you might imagine her to be.
Yeah, but I'd say that generally that there is no visible anti-incumbency in the state as we have travelled. Nitish Kumar still enjoys a lot of goodwill, and as we said that, so this is a different election compared to 2020. In 2020, there was in fact more anti-incumbency than what seems to be on the ground these days. Now, of course, there is.
पैसा कहाँ मिला?
आपको नहीं मिला?
नहीं मिला। हाँ?
मिलेगा, आपको उम्मीद है?
उम्मीद है कि ना है, कैसे बोलेंगे? मिलेगा तो हम ना बोलेंगे जब मिलेगा। नहीं मिला हम लोग का।
तो बाकी लोग जो पैसा लिया वो खुश हैं?
हाँ।
तो आप वेट कर रहे हैं अभी, इंतजार कर रहे हैं?
इंतजार कर रहे हैं, मिलेगा तो मिलेगा, नहीं मिलेगा तो क्या करेंगे?
कह रहे हैं देंगे, आपको विश्वास है कि देंगे कि नहीं?
विश्वास है, जब अपने हाथ में मिलेगा तखनी विश्वास है, अभी नहीं मिलेगा तो कैसे विश्वास करेंगे?
वेरी ट्रांजैक्शनल, दिस इज न्यूयॉर्क स्टाइल मर्केंटलिज्म. मिला तो विश्वास है, अदरवाइज नो सच थिंग. You want to go on a spin on the tractor around the farm?
Yeah, reminds me of my childhood days.
सर, क्या नाम है आपका?
मोहम्मद मुस्लिम.
मोहम्मद मुस्लिम. अभी क्या चल रहा है, क्या खेती कर रहे हैं अभी आप, क्या तैयारी कर रहे हैं?
यही चल रहा है, मक्का लग रहा है.
मक्का बो रहे हैं?
हाँ, मक्का लगा रहे हैं.
कब शुरू हुआ ये?
ये मक्का कल लग रहा है.
कल ही से लग रहा है?
हाँ.
अभी शुरू हुआ है?
नहीं, कल से लग रहा है.
तो क्या दिक्कतें हैं अभी आपकी?
कोई दिक्कत नहीं, काम चल रहा है.
काम चल रहा है. चलिए घुमाइए जरा, आपका खेत देख के आते हैं. रुचिर, at this moment in time, how do you think the Indian economy is faring relative to what's happening in the rest of the world?
Well, I think that the narrative has shifted a lot, which is that a year ago at this time, India was the hottest emerging market in the world. And in fact, in the last 1 year, the Indian market has massively underperformed other emerging markets, underperformed by 30 percentage point in dollar terms. We've never had a period where the Indian stock market has underperformed emerging markets by this magnitude over the last year or so. And this is because of a couple of issues. One, well, the Indian market had become very expensive a year ago, but I think the two fundamental shifts have also happened. That the big trade in the world in the last year has been the AI trade. And somehow India is seen as a bit of a loser in this AI trade, partly because there's a feeling going around that AI is going to take away lots of jobs. It's going to make it much more difficult for countries like India to climb up the development ladder, because so many of the jobs are going to be replaced by AI that could have been done by a lot of mid-level workers, whether it's BPOs or other such industries around the world. And the second thing has obviously been this ongoing trade dispute with the US, because at one point in time, India was seen to be the favored ally of the US, the so-called indispensable nation that no country could do without. And now all of a sudden we find ourselves in a bit of a box where the relations between US and China seem to have improved from the very low point a year ago. And as far as India is concerned, it's no longer being seen as this indispensable nation. And I think that those two shifts have led to, the Indian market significantly underperforming the rest of the world, and also the Indian economy too. There seems to be some slowdown as well, which is happening possibly as a knock-on effect of the trade stuff. But as you know, with India, we began this show by saying my favorite line is that this is a country that consistently disappoints the optimists and pessimists, and I still believe that. So I'm not too pessimistic ever on the Indian economy, but yeah, the extreme optimism of the last year or so, that seems to have blown off. And I think that the path forward now for India is the fact that if we see that the government keeps on carrying out some more reform steps. They did something on the GST front.
How significant do you think that was?
So that was a significant step.
How much of a multiplier do you think this is actually having in the real economy?
It's having some effect, but as I said, that we just can't do one thing and go on, right? We just need a series of steps going. How do we, stuff that we've spoken about for years together in our interviews, how do we make it much easier for Indian businessmen to do business here? What do we do to ease the pressure coming from, on the daily lives of people from the investigative, regulatory agency? I think all that still is work in progress that needs to be done, like in this country. But otherwise, I think that I'm resigned to the fact that we're a 6% type growing economy. That's a decent growth rate. 9-10% is not something which is within, something that we'll be able to easily achieve. And as I travel across Bihar, I take back the same message. On one, there is the hopeful message that small things can make a very big difference because the base is still very low. But the slightly distressing message is this, that it's still taking the government to give lots of welfare schemes to satisfy people, and that money is not going to be spent on infrastructure. And as we said, that even a state like Bihar and a lot of North India, for that matter, the very strong growth rates we saw, between 2005 to like 2015, those growth rates are regressing.
The per capita income gap between Bihar and Telangana now is as wide as 6 times.
There are parts of that Telangana, Karnataka that you travel that feel like a Thailand or a Philippines or an Indonesia. And then there are these parts of Bihar which still feel like sub-Saharan Africa. So that gap still is very jarring as I travel through India. But the overall story, it all adds up to, is still a country that's, cruising along at a 6% type growth rate.
Ruchir, President Trump has been giving India a really tough time on tariffs and being completely unreasonable, testing Prime Minister Modi's patience, who's been, very, very restrained despite all the provocations. How do you see this play itself out? Where does this end?
Well, I think that what India has to do here is to sort of also look a bit inward and see as to how we are doing on trade. Because if there's one thing which I can say here is that, yes, Trump and his tariff agenda is very difficult for any rational person to support. But I think there's something about the fact that India too had turned far too protectionist. So one thing which I was thinking which would possibly come good of this is that India needs to turn less protectionist in general, open up much more to trade with other countries, because...
Do you see that happen in the way that you'd expect?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some acceleration in that all of a sudden with things, whether it's the European Union, we know the deal with UK was done, but I think we need more of that. For example, I was recently in Indonesia, where I met with the Indonesian president and the government out there. And one thing that they were telling me was the fact that we want to do much more with India, but we find it still very difficult to deal with India, as a trading partner. Now, why should a country like Indonesia feel that way? So I think that, yes, in terms of the fact that Trump's agenda and the tariff stuff is something which is hard to support, but I think India just needs to look at it that what have we been doing on trade in the last few years? How do we become a more open economy? And why? And whether it's countries like Indonesia or other things, that even with these countries who don't really have an agenda against us, how do we improve our relations with them on the trade front? We're seeing some progress on that, as I said, with UK, EU. I would love to see much more of that done.
Ruchir, I remember the last time I spoke to you at Mumbai's Marine Drive, you said it's a matter of time before the year ends, the bond markets will get spooked out, Trump's going down the wrong route, and that American exceptionalism would end. It was tested in the middle.
Yes.
Trump back down, and America still seems to be seeing exceptional growth.
Yeah, so I'll make 2 points here. One, as you know, that when we spoke about that again in Delhi in April, it seemed as if there was a negative feedback loop which was developing after that. But there's a bigger force than Trump. So I don't think Trump has backed down. This is a big illusion out there, that all because Trump took a series of actions, there's been some back down, but there's not been a big back down. The tariff rates have still gone up. The effective tariff rate in America, depending how you calculate it today, is still close to 15% or so, compared to 2.5% that it used to be. That's a massive swing. Most people would have told you with such an increase in the tariff rate, America would have a recession. And that would have happened, and the tariff part of the economy is getting badly affected, but there's a bigger force than Trump. We all get obsessed with one narrative, and the bigger force is AI. Today, the American economy has become one big bet on AI. That the hyperscalers, the big tech companies in America today, they're spending close to $500 billion over the next year just on building the AI infrastructure. That's a massive impulse which is going on out there. And the belief that AI is going to fundamentally change the economy is a narrative that's become very strong around the world.
How much of a bubble do you think this is?
Well, this is some sort of a bubble but what's the definition of a bubble? A bubble is a good idea gone too far. So there's no doubt that I'm a big believer in that AI will have a transformative effect. But as happens with every technology in history, from railroads to the internet, that the good idea then gets sparred too much. There's too much money that comes chasing like the good idea. And then finally there's overinvestment, and that leads to declining returns over time. So one, that as far as the American economy is concerned, it was tested. And the fact is, but the AI effect has out-trumped Trump. That's one thing which has happened. Two, American exceptionalism. Ironically, that even though the AI boom is going on and America is at the center of it, the American stock markets this year, the performance compared to the rest of the world has been quite unexceptional, in fact. So in that way, American exceptionalism is not what it used to be. The American stock market so far this year is up about 15% or so in dollar terms. The rest of the world stock markets, on average, are up 25 to 30%. Emerging markets are up 30% this year in dollar terms. So this is the widest gap in performance between America and the rest of the world since 2009. So that way, this is the least so-called exceptional year for America in the last 15 to 16 years. We in India aren't feeling it because in dollar terms, the Indian market over the last year has been essentially flat. As I said, it's been the worst performance stretch for India on a relative basis compared to the rest of the world over the last 12 months. But the rest of the world, the stock markets, whether it's European banks or it's got to do with some Latin American consumer companies, all these have levitated and done very well over the last year. And I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future.
We're towards the end of this calendar year. What outlook are you forming for the Indian markets for the next year?
Well, I think that it's obviously better because, as I said, that from the very elevated valuations that we had a year ago, that doesn't make, for a good entry point. Remember that, when people are very excited and stuff like that, it's also the time when valuations get very high. So in a way, this valuation correction that's happened in the Indian market over the last year, the time correction, I think gives us a better reset. And I think that the other thing which I like about India is the fact that it's a market which is now big enough where global investors have to take seriously. So I think that over time, the Indian market will see greater allocations from global investors because after US, Europe and Japan, really, India is still, like a market which I'd say is very attractive for long-term investors to take a strategic stake. China has made a big comeback this year, by the way.
Does that continue, you think, next year as well?
Yeah, I think that...
Because for a long while it was said, and we discussed it, that China...
It was uninvestable. Yeah. But one of my top trends, which I put at the beginning of this year, was that China is investable again. And I think that that will continue because China is catching up on AI very quickly. The domestic economy in China is doing very poorly. The investment, the property boom, all that has gone bust. But again, where China has been able to stage a comeback, especially its stock market, is the fact that the AI boom in China has taken off, and China is showing that at a much lower cost, you can build out an AI infrastructure which is as competitive and possibly as cutting edge as what America has done. So that's China's so-called comeback path. But I think that the real opportunity over the next few years is going to lie in some of these emerging market stories. But as you know, that a lot of the money is still stuck in the US, and some of that was beginning to come out, but the AI boom is what's keeping a lot of money still sheltered within America.
आइए बाबू, आइए आइए, बैठिए 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 ना। क्या नाम है आपका?
बिसंदेव पासवान।
बिसंदेव पासवान जी। तो पासवान जी, कैसी चल रही है भाई जिंदगी आपकी?
बढ़िया चल रहा है सर।
चुनाव को लेके क्या सोच रहे हैं आप?
क्या सोचेंगे, हम लोग तो गरीब आदमी हैं,
तो कुछ सोच
कमाते हैं, खाते हैं।
तो सरकार से खुश है, नहीं खुश है?
सब खुश है सर, पेट भरता है, सब खुश है।
हाँ, नाराजगी नहीं है, गुस्सा नहीं?
नाराज काम करिए, खाइए।
अच्छा, तो क्या चाहेंगे आपकी नई सरकार क्या करे, क्या आप सोच रहे हैं?
हम लोग को तो गरीब आदमी है, घर बना दीजिए, ये बना दीजिए, तब ना।
तो घर तो है यहाँ पे?
घर तो ये तो है, वकील साहब का घर।
अच्छा अच्छा।
हम लोग का घर है रुपोली थाना सर।
और क्या चाहिए सरकार से?
और क्या चाहेंगे सर, कुछ ना, और कुछ नहीं।
शुक्रिया पासवान साहब, शुक्रिया। On an arc of history, given how well settled the government seems at this moment and the clear absence of any visible, cogent, forceful opposition, do you see this journey continue in this fashion for a few more years? Like, what's your macro view on Indian politics at the moment?
Yeah, I think that as far as, like in India is concerned, I think that the real battle will keep being fought at the state level, right? Because, I mean, if Bihar goes the way that generally people are talking about, then the entire thing shifts to Bengal. And then after that, the real battle is in UP in 2027, also because of things that, I know that so far it sounds all very premature, but will that set the stage for the next succession battle within the BJP? Will the next sort of, nature abhors a vacuum. So it's hard to extrapolate these things too long, because in like May of 2024, when the government suffered a bit of a setback in the election that happened then everyone thought that, maybe this is the end of Modi and the end of BJP. Instead, the BJP has won a string of state elections like after that, and that may continue, for a while. But I think that these things. So I don't like to extrapolate in Indian politics because these things shift, narratives shift very quickly. But I think that as of now, in terms of it, I think there's a bigger force in Indian politics also, which is taking place on a trend basis. This is the land of anti-incumbency in a way. That the word anti-incumbency was, in fact, coined by a couple of my fellow travelers here. And I think that that has shifted global now, which is that anti-incumbency has become a big trend in the West. And in India, in fact, we find that there's no longer a firm trend towards anti-incumbency. In fact, state governments are now finding a better chance of winning elections, partly because they've been able to co-opt digitization, partly because they've been able to give welfare schemes, and they have better control over the state machinery. And that's something which I think is also a factor at the national level, that, you have a lot of control over the state machinery, you have a lot of control over, the agencies and stuff, and that's happening at a national and somewhat at a state level as well. And so these factors are combining to almost create a bit of a pro-incumbency, that the days, we grew up following Indian elections when 2/3 of governments would lose elections in India. Now we are at a stage where maybe more than 50% of governments are beginning to win elections in India. So that's the big shift which has happened in Indian politics over the last 20 to 30 years.
Ruchir, we've spoken in New York, New Delhi, Mumbai, but I think Purnia was a lot of fun, extremely memorable. This for taking our time and joining us on the election trail. For this, the first episode of NDTV's Walk the Talk in its new avatar. Thank you very much.
Well, this was a pleasure. As I said, that I travel the world, but the 1 week I spend in India every year for 30 years now, covering elections. And, everyone wants me, when I go back, everyone wants me to say, okay, what's the result going to be? And yes, you have to force and tell what the result is. But for me, this is just a journey of India, that I feel the happiest when in this 1 week around the world I travel, when I get to travel within India. So hopefully next we'll meet in Bengal.
Look forward to that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Rahul.